Now, let's be clear from the outset. Plot is not the same as story, but I'm sure you know that. Story is what happens, plot is how it happens. In this video, we'll show you what it takes to write compelling stories so your reader or viewer is enthralled. First, we'll explore what story and plot are, then we'll show you how to build stories to make them more immersive, and then finally, we'll show you how to apply this to your own work. You all know the one about how story, plot, and pace walk into a bar and the barman asks, "Is this a bestseller or what?" or something like that. Anyway, story is the events, and plot is the sequence in which those events happen. First, story, plot, and pace all walk into the bar. Second, the barman notices them. And third, the barman responds as quoted. That's the sequence of events, which just happens to be in chronological order. Now, imagine that the barman makes his quip before seeing the elements, as we'll now call them. Would the effect be the same? Would it be as funny? Not that it was. Well, possibly. But it would require a little more creative description for it to make sense. Playing around with plot is not new. Homer's The Iliad begins in media res, which means in the middle of things. The reader is thrown into the middle of war with seeing Lysice, with very little exposition provided. Exposition is the background. Plot, story, and pace were feeling thirsty and wanted a drink, and therefore went to the bar. There's your exposition. And then follows the sequence of events outlined. Start, middle, and end. This isn't the most interesting piece of fiction we've ever heard, certainly not the Iliad. So it's better to add some other elements, such as conflict, climax, and resolution. You've likely heard these before. We'll call them milestones. Conflict is the biggie. It provides the reason for your characters to act in the ways they do, besides their character traits. Let's say that on the way to the bar, the elements encounter a militant teetotal leprechaun who wants to prevent them from reaching the bar and sneaking a few drinks. This is a conflict. It creates tension, suspense, and obstacles for the elements to overcome to reach their goals. This makes the leprechaun an antagonist. So the elements, story, plot, and pace are our characters. And characters must have a motive, the reason they act the way they do, what drives them, so to speak. The type of conflict and motive will depend on the type or genre of book you're writing. Romances place emotional, and sometimes physical, obstacles between star-crossed lovers, and their love remains either unrequited or unconsummated for most of the text. Mysteries place a seemingly unsolvable crime for the DI or inspector to solve through the gradual uncovering of clues, resulting in the criminal being apprehended. And more character-focused fiction places obstacles in the characters themselves, such as personality flaws or social conflicts, which are overcome through character development, and they eventually achieve whatever they desire. Or not, but that's a different video. Of course, texts of any genre can include any and all of these simultaneously. There is usually one main overarching conflict, however, and this conflict is often counter to their motive. Our elements, the characters, are thirsty and want to quench their thirst, the motive, but the leprechaun, the antagonist, is preventing them from doing so, the conflict. There can be several conflicts along the way, either aside from or supplementing the main conflict. Let's say the leprechaun is actually the hitman for an even more militant teetotaler who the elements encounter after getting past the first leprechaun. The odds against the elements have increased, and their eventual victory is made greater when they reach the bar and have a drink. We have then the exposition, their thirst, rising tension when the leprechaun appears, and the climax when the leprechaun is told to shove off and they get their drinks. The climax is the peak of the tension when the stakes are highest. We all know the moment. Death Star 2.0 is destroyed, or Brad Pitt asking, "What's in the box?" Then there's the stuff afterwards, the come-down. This is what we call the denouement, when events are rounded off, where Luke and Leia share their secret, and the galaxy begins to carry on its merry way. Things have changed, however, and this is the purpose of the denouement. The criminal is locked away, and additional clues are explained. The lovers prepare for their lives together, or the shy girl steps down from the stage after giving an impressive performance, adjusting to her newfound confidence. Our elements, then, overcome the leprechaun and reach the bar. They take a drink and ease into their evening. This is their denouement. These are the main ingredients in a basic story. Now you get to play with how they are presented to the reader. If we were to follow the example of Homer and begin in media res, we would meet our elements in the midst of battle with the leprechaun, physical or verbal, you decide, and exposition would have to be provided later. We might choose to show this piecemeal, in flashbacks, for example. Or we could start with the denouement and provide flashbacks to the exposition, rising tension, and then, finally, the climax. Starting in media res presents the author with the challenge of managing exposition, maintaining rising tension enough to justify the climax and denouement. How you plot your story can be adapted to your intended focus. Mysteries and thrillers usually work best in chronological order because the rising tension and climax are better for putting bums on edges of seats. But placing the denouement first and framing the rest of the story around that often works well for more reflective, character-focused texts where the protagonist has evolved or come to some realizations. Likewise, alternating between past and present can also serve the same purpose well. Let's say the narrative follows the leprechaun too. We now have two sets of milestones for each perspective, for both the elements and the leprechaun. The leprechaun may also have conflicts of his own before he even reaches the elements. This is what we call a subplot. Let's say the leprechaun has an elderly grandmother, Grandma Leprechaun, who berates him for not visiting often enough. This could be an emotional conflict. He feels guilty, but he overcomes his resistance and visits Grandma Leprechaun after being defeated by the elements. This resolves the subplot. Perhaps the leprechaun has evolved as a character, and he's learnt to mind his own business and focus on his nearest and dearest. And of course, these plots, subplots, and perspectives can all overlap and interact, leaving us with a narrative equivalent of opium, such as The Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. There might also be conflicts amongst the elements, which serves as a further impediment to their progress. Maybe story is secretly aligned with the leprechaun, or perhaps plot secretly hates pace and wants him to fail. Imagine these arrangements stretched over the course of several novels, and you begin to see the careful planning required to create a well-plotted saga. One way to approach this is to implement the Fichte curve theory of story development. This contains all the elements already described, except exposition is provided through a series of crises, or trials, that the protagonist must endure before they reach their final trial. You might think of The Wizard of Oz, or The Lord of the Rings, and the Hunger Games trilogies. E.M. Forster, in his seminal Aspects of the Novel, talks about the shape and symmetry of novels. He describes one novel as an hourglass, in which two characters with very different personalities meet to form the top bulb of an hourglass, their meeting of course being the climax to form the neck. Having met, their lives changed forever. They begin to diverge to form the bottom bulb, and thus complete the hourglass shape. The novel is therefore symmetrical and leaves the reader with a feeling of completion. The character development, story, and plot all work together to create an emotional, immersive experience. You may picture your text in the same way, if this allows you to plot more carefully. The common denominator in all of these structures is changeability. The world begins one way and changes throughout the narrative. Does it begin with the status quo and then events propel the protagonist into action? Or does the text begin with crisis and end with establishing a new status quo? Each example has its advantages and disadvantages, and each presents difficulties for the writer who must build the world in which the characters live. Ultimately, though, they must be bound by one thing: causality. Although you can play around with the order of events in a story, they still need to maintain a sense of continuity. B happens because of A, and C happens because of A and B. Our characters are thirsty A, which drives them to go to the bar, B, on the way to which they meet, and then fight, the leprechaun, C. Clearly, they would never have met the leprechaun if they'd never started their journey, and this would remain so even if we are shown events in a different order. Approaches to plotting can vary. Charles Dickens liked to plan his novels in great detail, which might be expected for longer pieces, whereas others prefer to take a few characters, throw them into a premise and go from there. Others prefer to plan the essentials, but allow the characters to take them in directions not otherwise planned for. There are pros and cons of all approaches, but generally each text is unique and might therefore require a more holistic approach. If you aren't strong on writing action, in the conventional sense, perhaps try a more reflective structure. The mantra, show, don't tell, still applies, but the focus and pace is different. It's natural for a text to start slower if you're attempting the straightforward chronological approach, but then the writer must maintain this forward momentum, which presents challenges of its own. Similarly, a more reflective structure can become tedious if not injected with some timely bursts of quick-paced action. Jane Eyre begins with action. Within the first few pages, Bronte sets up a conflict with Mrs. Reed, which establishes or provides an insight into Jane's independence, which drives her throughout the novel. Don't assume that action means guns and helicopters. Action is whatever moves the prose along. Conflict and action are the crux of pace. And it is pace which keeps the reader reading. You probably now already have an idea of how to manage pace, but you could envisage your plot as a stream of water. By controlling the action provided at particular points in the story, you create or remove a blockage in the stream. More action means more flow, which means more pace. This can be achieved in several ways: sentence length and structure, fixation on a period of time, maintaining a particular character's perspective, and postponement of resolution. For example, you might leave one character hanging from a cliff edge and shift to another character whose narrative is slower or whose narrative still needs to catch up to the other. If handled delicately, this will ultimately create suspense, which is tension refined. By using longer sentences with more clauses, you can create a sense of chaos, or you can intentionally slow the reader down. Winding sentences used to describe the character's journey through a winding street, for example, or a two-word sentence to deliver a pithy conclusion to a carefully described brawl. But be careful not to overuse this technique. Similarly, you can slow the text down by freezing the action. Let's say that we have so far described the conflict between the elements and the leprechaun using compact sentences, and events have progressed quickly, but we want the pace to slow down. You can choose to fixate for a short time on a particular place, theme, or object. In the middle of the Iliad, we're given a lengthy description of Achilles' shield, which provides the speaker with an opportunity to adjust the pace and explore themes using symbolism. This heightens suspense and prepares us for what is to follow. Here's a writing exercise for you to try. Write a story. The character goes about their day, driving to work, completing tasks. The narrative will move at a normal pace, but then focus in on one particular activity, describing the details. Interweave with this some of the character's thoughts. How has it changed the pace? What aspects of the character or story has it allowed you to explore? Now change the order of events. Do you have to add extra detail to explain particular things? Does this present you with opportunities to build suspense? You probably now see why writing a one-man play or a multi-character saga can each be difficult and can present their own challenges. It requires a very special kind of writer to master both forms. We hope you found this video informative. Please like and subscribe for more writing hints and tips, and like and follow our Facebook page for up-to-date industry news.